Tonight, we won't measure history by verdicts or tally up names from the rolls of the condemned. Instead, I'll stand in the hush of a church porch where a single bronze ring could weigh more than any sword, where one knock on an ancient door could turn pursuit into pause and fear into 40 borrowed nights. The air is cool stone and candle smoke, thick with the sense that law itself has stopped outside, waiting in the dark like a restless guest. Inside, the silence feels older than judgment. It holds the sound of steps, the scratch of a clerk's quill, and the long patience of walls that remember more pleas than prayers. So lower the lights. Let the rhythm of the bell carry through your chest, even if it tolls only in memory now. And if your breath begins to follow that measured pace slow, even certain, that's just the night offering you its own kind of sanctuary. If quiet refuges like this one help you drift, you might let me know where you're listening from. Perhaps the next door will open there, waiting for you. The story will wait just beyond that threshold, steady as stone and unhurried as breath. 40 nights will pass there like lanterns carried one by one through a cloister, each glow marking time without asking for it. Some will step across the line with urgency, others with trembling hands. But the door itself has never hurried anyone. It knows that every decision, every plea, comes slower in the dark. So lean with me into that pause where law softens into silence, and silence becomes its own kind of record. Whether your eyes remain open or drift toward sleep, the walls will keep the tally in their own way. And we will follow the sound of the bell into the first night of sanctuary. The knock was really dramatic. It was often a scuff or a palm pressed to a lion head knocker that was more weather than lion. Durham Cathedral still has one all-wide mouth and dutiful ring, a doorbell for emergencies that happen mostly after midnight. The porter counted, not because counting mattered, but because counting felt official, and in these matters officialness was the same as safety. The supplicant, sometimes muddy and sometimes wearing a very small hat that had failed to keep the rain off, said the words, "Sanctuary for God in this house." The phrase was not long. The breath that carried it was often shorter. In some places, the bell rang 13 times, which is a number that does nothing in law but makes a good story. On a wax tablet, the porter, or someone better with vowels, scratched the name and the charge and the hour. The clock began, and it did not care if the ink blotted or if the scribe's dog slept on the page. 40 nights. Not 39 and a good excuse. 40. The moment the ring cooled and the bell stopped complaining, the geography rearranged itself quietly. A patch of porch, a thread of nave, a space so clearly bounded by custom that you did not need a fence to see it. The sheriff's men, who were definite about footwear and indefinite about jurisdiction, stopped at the threshold. The accused, who might be guilty, who might be unlucky, who might be both, stepped into a jurisdiction made of stone, candles, and rules thicker than the walls. No weapon, said the canon law, which had nothing to say about sharp cheekbones or pointed remarks. No quarrel within, added custom, which had a long memory for fistfights that had gone poorly. The church was not a hotel, though it looked like one for the next section of our program. It was a legal island that did not move even when the river did. Border control consisted of a formula and the ability to ask for straw. Inside, mornings had a way of peeling carefully over the nave. Someone, often a deputy with stiff knees, brought bread in a bucket. The bread was the kind designed to last longer than an argument. The bucket was politely ambiguous and had its own schedule. A verger or a volunteer set up near the door, not to judge. The job was to keep the rule from being rewritten by enthusiasm. The ledger grew. Names came in a kind of whisper. The charges were louder. Theft of a cloak, stabbing in a lane, a horse that ran away with the wrong person on it. When new arrivals were men, they tended to be very new. When new arrivals were women, the door felt heavier to the watcher, who knew how markets talk. Pages went on being pages, recording date, name, place of birth if anyone cared, the offense if anyone dared write the whole thing out. The handwriting settled into a rhythm that looked patient. Patient is the opposite of interesting, which is perfect for sleep. There was routine. The morning check-in, still within sanctuary, still unarmed, still not arguing with that man about who owned the knife first. The day's care was practical. Straw was gathered and redistributed in a way that looked like compassion and accounted like maintenance. Children, if there were children, were counted twice and called angels once. Visitors were allowed under supervision. An advocate arrived and coughed gently to get the paperwork's attention. A cousin came by to say there was no money for a lawyer, but some room by the hearth if the verdict went sideways. The questions were always careful and often short. "Do you intend to abjure?" asked an official who had trained to pronounce abjure without blinking. "Do you understand that the realm will be exactly the same shape, only you will be on the outside?" The answers came with long pauses, because answers here had to fit within the lines painted on the floor by tradition. History, like a quiet neighbor, prefers you to keep your voice down after dusk. 40 days is longer than most storms and shorter than most grudges. The law chose the number for reasons that made sense at the time, which is all that numbers ever need. It meant there was time for tempers to chill and for friends to pawn a cloak, and for the sheriff to decide if this one was worth the walk. It meant the prisoner better to say the claimant, because the church liked words that sounded clean had time to choose. At some houses, someone would bring a small armful of miracles, a token, a relic, a story about a previous case in which a notorious thief became a respectable grocer in Bruges. The rules did not require belief. They required staying inside, not carrying knives, and being kind to the ledger. Visitors stood at the threshold and did that shuffle people do when they want to look supportive and look at the stonework at the same time. The clerk's script, small and tidy as a fenced garden, added names with slow joy, because clerks enjoy a proper noun. Alice, daughter of Thomas, late of Southgate. Henry, famulous to a man he declines to name. Scribes love to write, declines to name. It made every pen feel like a curtain. Witnesses put their hands on things, wood, gospel, gossip, and said the quiet parts loud. In one corner, the sheriff's man pretended he did not hear. In another, a monk measured patience by the inch and recommended prayer without specifying what for. A modern analogy might be the waiting area at a train station when trains are not running. The announcements repeat. Someone keeps checking the timetable as if it might answer back. Meanwhile, bread. Time inside sanctuary teaches you to count differently. By candles, by bells for the hours, by the way sunlight moves across the same sentence of stone. You begin to measure days by the number of times you have said, "I have nothing to add," which is also the motto of several medieval institutions. Microhook, the most dangerous item smuggled into sanctuary, was often not a weapon, but new information which could wound even in holy places. It is remarkable how many people wanted to help with information. It is equally remarkable how much preferment could be earned by postponing the moment when it mattered. On one of these mornings, but any will do, the ordained clerk who doubled as a messenger, accountant, and moral weather vane arrived with a map that was more corridor than country. He explained the choice the way a baker explains loaves, plainly with no expectation of surprise. You could wait for a trial and be returned to the cheerful theater of charge and jury and sentence, or you could abjure the realm. Abjuration was not exactly exile. It was the legal version of promising to leave and then actually leaving, with everyone writing it down. The choice is strangely modern. Embrace the process, or avoid it by agreeing to become a newspaper headline in another language. Choosing the trial meant staying in the box made of stone until somebody important was ready to open it. Choosing abjuration meant the next 40 days would shrink into a single road. The oath was the hinge. Bareheaded, hand on gospel, the claimant swore to walk a path they did not draw, to a harbor they did not choose, along roads that could not be politely modified. There would be no tavern, no dallying, no detours to have a last look at the dog. You wore a cross on your chest like an exaggerated piece of flair, and you carried the staff that said, "I cannot stop and I must not fight." If you fought, you were outside the law, and nobody was obligated to remember your middle name. If you stopped, the sanctuary clock, just a handful of marks in the coroner's roll, switched off, and you met the regular clock, which has sharp edges. And still, the oath felt like relief, because it replaced the geometry of fear with the arithmetic of distance. You could add the miles like a polite tax. The coroner came because coroners then loved a good line of ink. He listened to the oath with his ear tilted to one side and wrote down the angle of the tilt in letters that resembled a row of small fences. He gave the map, which was really a paragraph listing gates. This gate, then that cross, then the bridge, then the river, and finally the ship, which had a name that sounded like a cough. He set a deadline. Not a cruel one, but one that made you aware of how much a boot weighs. If someone intercepted you, you were not allowed to defend yourself with anything sharper than explanation. The road became a rail. At every fork, there was no fork. The law loves a straight line, even when geography does not. Outside, the world had opinions. Men at alehouses talked about the case with the competence of men at alehouses. Women at market wrapped fish in the news and observed that a person who had the nerve to knock on the church door deserved at least a crust. Children turned the oath into a game and got the rules wrong, in exactly the way children do. Meanwhile, the claimant rehearsed their route and shaved without realizing that a razor could be considered a weapon if someone wanted to make a point. There were cautions that sounded like riddles. Keep to the king's highway, even if it is muddy, because lame loving is a sign of guilt. Cross on the bridge, even if the ford looks friendly, because friendly is the opposite of legal. If a dog follows you, pretend it belongs to the road. If a cousin follows you, pretend they belong to the dog. The law's straightness lasted only as long as it had to. Some who swore the oath reached the harbor and became a neat Latin verb departed. Others reached the harbor and became a story about a shipmaster who preferred coin to justice. A few found that the road bends even when texts insist it does not. They slipped away at the edge of town and became bakers or ghosts, or rumors about bakers and ghosts. The record's favorite phrase was "no further news." In court rolls, that phrase sits like a small polite shrug, not pursued, not acquitted. Simply no further news? For sleep, this is the most humane ending, a sentence that does not end because it never pretends to finish. Back at the door, the marks of mercy were not bright. No medals, no plaques. Sometimes a brooch left at the altar, or a coin blessed with a kind of side-eye. Sanctuary was not a parade of saintly deeds. It was a careful pause in a loud world. The church liked order more than drama, and you can tell by what it recorded. Tokens appear the braid cut from a child's hair, a pair of boots with extra holes, the odes of friends who signed with a cross because their names did not like the quill. Some houses rang a trumpet when an abjurer departed, and preferred to note in the margin that the trumpet rung, which sounds as if the trumpet made a decision on its own. Other houses wrote down the weather, which may be the most accurate legal commentary ever produced. The sheriff's men returned to the doorway like a tide with good manners. The drama that had been suspended now resumed on the far side of the hinge. If there was a trial, it happened in a room that smelled like timber and men who remembered their youth selectively. If there was no trial, there were rumors that tried to wear a verdict as a hat. Mercy was certainly practiced, but rarely displayed. A pardon from the king arrived with a flourish you could fold and put in your pocket. A reconciliation in a tavern arrived with none, and the alehouse remembered it better. Generosity is less photogenic than revenge, which is why parchment is always ready for the latter and a little shy with the former. When records do praise kindness, they do it with accounting words. A fine remitted, a forfeiture forgiven, a bond returned. It reads like mercy carefully disguised as arithmetic. Meanwhile, the archivists, who could fall asleep on an index if they weren't careful, kept their thin volumes with affection. Some entries are masterpieces of brevity: came, claimed, fed, abjured. Others are miniature novels in nonchalant Latin, pausing only to note that the claimant delayed without cause, which is an opinion disguised as an adverb. Clerks loved adverbs because adverbs cannot be arrested. Sometimes you find the opposite, an entire line left blank where a name should be, as if someone pulled it out like a splinter. The scribe would not comment. The page would age toward yellow, and the emptiness would become the most eloquent part. Sanctuary did not end because it failed. It ended because courts grew confident, sheriffs grew faster, and cities mastered the art of being everywhere at once. The custom narrowed from any church to a few, then to fewer. The 40 Nights turned into a memory that the law nodded at once a generation. Later writers shook their heads and decried abuses in the way you decry a market where the apples are too shiny. Yet, in the margins, it never quite went away. As late as you like, someone still reaches for a handle at night, and a porter who keeps a pencil behind his ear decides that ringing a bell is good for the soul. There were places where sanctuary stretched into franchises, Durham with its sanctuary knocker that now entertains tourists and pigeons equally. Beverly, where St. John's Minster kept the names of those who came and asked for 40 days as if they were asking for a chair. Westminster had its own rules because Westminster always does. Scotland allowed sanctuary in the girth of holy sites long after the phrase fell out of polite conversation. On the continent, churches offered asylum that looked similar but tasted administratively different. The words changed outfits. The idea kept the same shoes. A hand on a holy thing could still slow the world. The gaps in the record are sleep-friendly. You can lie down happily on a phrase like "further nothing." It's a librarian's lullaby. We do not know if Henry made it to the ship. We do not know if Alice married a man who laughed at the right time. We know, perhaps, that a clerk smudged his sleeve and that someone lent someone else a cloak that came back smelling of salt and not much else. We know that parish chests were prized not for their decoration but for their locks, which is a way of saying that people tend to hide the same things in every century: money, paper, and the opportunity to start again. What keeps drawing the mind back is not the drama that sometimes began at these doors, but the absence of drama that followed the knock. The porch becomes a tiny country with its own visa stamp. The rules are narrow and strangely kind, as if someone looked at the average human life and thought, what this person needs is sleep, bread, and a corridor with no choices. The law agrees to disagree with itself for a predictable number of nights. The sheriff who carries iron on principle carries patience as an experiment. The church, which keeps time with bells, allows a second clock to tick beside it, neither louder nor faster, merely stubborn. And so you can imagine an evening when the porter puts the ledger away, smoothing a page with the side of his hand so the ink will not complain overnight. The straw settles like a sigh. Someone snores in a tone that suggests innocence, or at least exhaustion. Outside, the city continues to have opinions. Inside, the rules are boring on purpose. No weapon, no quarrel, no leading lines you cannot see. If you can keep your eyes open, which is optional, you can study the patterns of the stonework and decide that the masons like triangles, a very safe motif. The candle gutters and then steadies. The bell waits for its hour. The 40 nights continue to be 40, not a night more, not a night less. And if you drift off before the clerk comes back with more bread and a better adverb, that too is within the custom. You might not expect a single bell hung above a drafty stair to tell an entire town when to stop boiling soup, bank fires, and remember where they put the door key. But for centuries, that was the whole point of evening. A rope, a wheel, and a sound that rolled across roofs like a polite reminder from the sky. That was curfew. The word asks you to cover the fire, not your face, though many people did both out of habit. If you're still awake by the time we compare candle lengths to official yardsticks, feel entirely free to subscribe, or simply yawn in the general direction of the bell tower and treat that as informed consent. Nothing urgent is approaching. The bell will warn us if it tries. At dusk, a man whose job title was either grand or very simple beadle, ringer, sexton, or Thomas walked the same stairs he always walked. They were worn in the middle and argumentative near the top. He felt for the notch where people had scratched a calendar into the wood with their boots. Winter meant 2 coats, and the rope felt like a familiar snake. Summer meant the rope was a warm cat. The ringer checked the clapper because clappers developed personalities. One that loved to stick, one that loved to echo, one that had been mended by a blacksmith who charged a story in a penny. Then he pulled, and the town agreed to become evening. Curfew did not end the day. It made the day smaller and tidier, like folding a map. The rule itself was practical and uninterested in poetry. After the bell, bank hearths, shut shop shutters, stifle sparks, carry lanterns if you must step out. The sound went further than any proclamation nailed to a door because sound travels faster than people read. Bakers listened with one ear while bullying dough. Innkeepers listened while counting coins with their thumb because thumbs are trustworthy in finance. Children counted strikes and guessed at how many beats until the watch would rumble by with halberds and opinions. A town felt itself tighten by degrees, latches thudded. Backyard hens discovered that regulations rarely consult poultry. Dogs disliked curfew because dogs enjoy exceptions, and curfew professionally disliked those. Curfew varied as much as soup recipes. Some places rang 9, an oddly satisfying number, perhaps because it looks like a question when written hastily. Others rang a little earlier on market days or when the mayor had indigestion. Certain towns struck a warning peal first, a sort of begin banking fires now and find your more obedient children, followed by the real thing. The bell also had a day off on certain feast days because feast days were conversational. In university towns, the bell had extra duties, such as convincing students to go inside before inspiration met ale and produce footnotes in the street. Microhook. One college kept a second, smaller bell purely to argue with the first, a tradition technically known as redundant safety. The firepiece of curfew made domestic choreography slow and thoughtful. You could not simply flick 9 on and wander off to your pillow followed by a herd of batteries. You stirred embers like a librarian closing a book. You tucked ash over warmth until it resembled modesty. If you knew your craft in your hearth, you could coax a coal to survive until morning. If you didn't, you learned to borrow a brand from a neighbor while wearing an expression that said friendship and not negligence. The official tool for banking was sometimes a pan with a lid, sometimes a shovel that had acquired a lineage, sometimes a tile so cracked it made a good sermon about temperance. People named their irons, which is extremely sensible when you think how many other things in a house do not listen. There was also the law side of the sound. Watchmen began their shift with a coordination that looked like an unambitious parade. 2 men, 1 lantern that disliked wind, and a staff that had more to do with morale than combat. They walked the rounds, calling the hour, which turned out to be optional when no one possessed a watch that agreed with anyone else. Past 9 o'clock and a fair night, they called, or past midnight and a mist, or the classic past 2 and a cloudy morn, which works even if it is not. Morning, and the cloud is your breath. Their voices wandered down lanes and rose up chimneys. People inside beds acknowledged them the way you acknowledge a distant relative, respectfully, and with the hope the visit would continue on past your house. Ringers were paid by stipend and thanks, in that order. Minutes of vestry meetings note the stipend. The thanks are implied by the fact that the bell rope was replaced before it threatened to become two ropes with different philosophies. The rope frayed where the ringer's hand knew the story by heart. Some churches tacked a little leather sleeve along that section to save the palm and make a noise no bird could imitate. The ringer's most delicate act, oddly, was stopping the bell without making it look like an accident. You cannot simply let it swing down into silence. A whole town can tell the difference between finished and drop the rope because of a sneeze. There was technique, a careful slowing, a final small note like kiting a sentence. Doors during curfew were not so much locks as statements. Bolts thumped with a sound that does not echo in the same way now that we use metal designed by committees. Bars slid into sockets that had wear marks like smile lines. Keys slept in predictable places and in secret places because families enjoyed testing each other. Windows learned to be less talkative and shutters became literary, closed on one side, cracked on the other, offering a thin plot where gossip could pass like moths. Homes turned into fortresses of blankets and stories. Nightcaps had personalities, and lace had opinions about smoke. Embers glowed through ash like the polite eye of an elderly cat. There were exceptions to every quiet rule. Doctors fetched in the dark were allowed to look medical about it. Millers sometimes kept their wheels whispering because grain is not a morning person. Midwives walked curfew like rivers ignore fences. Babies are constitutionally disappointed by schedules. Bakers worked under a treaty with common sense, which is to say their ovens negotiated for them. Taverns whose patrons had lost track of the bell struck a covenant with the watchlight your way home, sirs, and sing softer. The watch would nod and pretend they had heard softer singing before. Even thieves learn the bell's hour because thieves are excellent at clocks that announce themselves. The little technologies of the night are charming in their stubbornness. Horn lanterns took a candle and wrapped it in a kind of transparent hoof, which turned weather away with agricultural grace. Rushlights were misnamed. They were slow plants dipped in fat and asked to impersonate time. Our candles had marks going down their sides that suggested the candle knew mathematics. In reality, drafts had other ideas. Elbow-warming hand stoves hung like metal handbags full of temper. Sandglasses took offense at stares and brought a philosophical calm to any argument about length. No one owned precision. Everyone owned rhythm. The bell's job was not to end work. The bell's job was to gather that rhythm into a choir that tuned itself to sleep. Timekeeping before the talented tyranny of gears meant listening for other towns' bells on very still nights and pretending to compare. Ringers prided themselves on knowing what properly late sounded like. A chapel across the river always ran ahead in Advent, which the main church tolerated like a neighbor cutting a hedge too artfully. The moon offered advice nobody asked for. Stars repeated their old lessons. In winter, the night had more authority and more space to write footnotes on roofs. In summer, curfew could feel like an administrative gesture. Everyone still obeyed it because once rituals have a groove, feet fall into it even while inventing reasons. Someone kept a list. Lists like this are universal. Paid to John for mending the ladder. Paid to Ellen for grease for the hinge. Paid to the boy who fetched the beetle when the rope fell. Paid to the beetle for having been fetched. The entries look polite because ink is polite. You can see the year when they switched from paying for tallow to paying for oil, and you can pretty much smell the difference on the page. There is a note where the council discussed replacing the bell because a crack can turn a municipal obligation into a jazz solo. Bells crack for interesting reasons, including age, enthusiastic ringing after harvest, and the violent opinion of thunderstorms. The bell founder arrived saying very little and listening very hard, for bells reveal their wounds to people who tilt their heads correctly. The curfew tradition had regional accents. In some French towns, the couvre-feu came with announcements about stray pigs, which suggests pigs enjoyed their own ideas of bedtime. In certain English ports, the bells signaled when to haul fires into iron pans so the wind could not interview them. In low country towns with water that kept turning up in conversation, the bell told sluice keepers to think damp thoughts. Universities layered curfews like pastry. The city rang once for households, again for scholars, and occasionally a third time for scholars who had become households unexpectedly. Micro Huck. One city posted the fine for being outdoors after the bell on the door of the bell tower, which is a delightful piece of civic humor. And always there was the watch, steady as an old cart horse. Their cressets, a fancy name for a small portable bonfire in an iron basket made smell as much as light. Sparks walked away in tiny groups and died courteously in puddles. The watchman's complaints were so traditional that they could be sung, and sometimes were, "The lantern is sulking," "The halberd is heavier when nobody is looking," "The hourglass is opinionated," and "The dog has chosen a new leader." Doors creaked open for passes with indigo ribbons, and closed again with that particular dignity wood develops when it has outlived 3 generations of hands. Somewhere a cat performed quiet experiments on the possibility of becoming smoke. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, curfews still existed but had grown more ceremonial, like an elderly relative who still gives advice about ceilings. Gas lamps arrived like domesticated stars, first a novelty and then quickly an assumption. Night became less of a strong room and more of a boulevard. The watch turned into police with notebooks full of identical lines. Bells that used to tell people to go inside learned to tell them how to rejoice publicly at national news, which is a different skill for a bell, and not always appreciated by the bell when practiced early. In some places, the evening peal kept its job but lost its authority, becoming the sound that made pies go into ovens rather than fires go under ashes. But traces remained. University towns kept a bell named Habit. Cathedral closes let the bell roll out 5 sober notes at 9:00. Clock and called it custom while admitting privately it was opinion. Village churches kept a curfew out of courtesy to ancestors and because the ringer enjoyed the walk. London had night wards with regulations that survived as interesting punctuation long after anyone read the sentence. Rural parishes rang the kid for bed peal, which is not its official name, but might as well be. People whose memories were made of sound carried the bell inside them the way others carry a favorite smell of bread. A doorway at night, a hand on wood, a muffled town. What began as fire safety became a philosophy of edges. Curfew taught people to be briefly less interesting, which is a surprisingly restful instruction. It made the street behave like a book with a bookmark. Travelers listened and quickened their step. Local arguments acquired commas and then full stops. Bishops took comfort in order. Mayors took comfort in routine. Ringers took comfort in kinetic grammar. There's a small dignity in knowing that at a given hour, you and every neighbor obey the same sound. A modern version might be the hum a refrigerator makes in an apartment building very late, when you remember that you do not live alone because the house has a throat. The archive, as always, is sleepy and kind. Item to the ringer for curfew, 3D. Item for oil for the lanterns at the gates, by D. Item for new rope by reason of fray. Short sentences that ask for no applause. Occasionally a line breaks its pattern. Item paid to Thomas for ringing when all were brought at the fire in Mill Lane. The bell did its job anyhow, because bells are not paid to improvise with public feelings. Another entry notes that the curfew was forborne by reason of the Queen's progress, which means everyone went outside to be official and hear trumpets pretending to know the hour. The bell, which knows better, waited. If you step under an old tower today, making sure the gift shop doesn't close you in, you might find the curfew rope still tucked up like a tail. Sometimes it is tied with a complicated knot that only the ringer loves. Sometimes it is simply looped so that no one trips during hymn 6. If someone lets you try, pull gently. Bells do not care for heroics. Listen not for command now, but for memory. The way sound travels down stone and into foot. The way it lingers in the rafters as if it had forgotten its hat. Imagine shutters softening, ash turning tender, the watch clearing a reasonable throat, and the cat discovering that pillows exist. The town is not asleep. It is politely turning the page. And so the bell keeps its modest appointment with evening. It rings not to astonish, but to calendar the dark. We are asked to bank the little fires we carry around with us, our plans for brilliance at midnight, our sudden desires to reorganize cupboards and let them be embers under ash, bright enough to nurse, dull enough to ignore. If you're still awake, you can think about rope fibers, how many hands they have known. You can measure the distance from tower to door, door to bed, bed to breath. You can wait for the final small note as the wheel steadies, the most negotiable of sounds. Or you can let the sound place its hand on your lids and explain that all will be there in the morning. The hearth, the hinges, the ordinary town, and the bell that does not hurry anyone, least of all you. You might not expect a single cold ring of iron to argue with an entire kingdom, but there it was. A lion-headed knocker the size of a human face, and a fist that had practiced being brave. The knock traveled into wood, into stone, into a chaplain's ears, and then into the quiet machinery of a rule so old it creaked a little when it stood. One touch on that ring and the world shifted half an inch. A door became a border. A porch turned into a small country with its own customs, and all the surrounding law had to stop in the street and neaten its hat. If you re-still somehow awake by the time I get to the bit where a town crier carries a portable desk to make a note about a footprint, feel entirely free to subscribe. Or don't. The door will keep doing its job, and I will keep talking very softly about it. The ritual began at an hour that made everyone's writing look tired the next day. Midnight arrived like a lantern entering a puddle. Steeples pretended not to notice. The porter came with keys and a vocabulary of hinges. He counted in the old way, once, twice, thrice, and said the words that turned night into jurisdiction. Sanctuary for God and his house, and some Latin that had the comfortable smells of beeswax and patience. The fugitive, now a petitioner, because nouns enjoyed a costume change, stepped across the threshold, without weapons or boots that clicked too loudly. He spoke his name because names are how the law finds you in daylight. He spoke his charge because rumors have a poor filing system. He spoke his need, which was a bed where prison would not be, and rope would not find the ceiling. If you are wondering about the mood, it was administrative with a noticeable kindness. Clerks arrived the way cats arrive, already knowing everything. One wrote in a ledger whose corners had been rubbed into friendliness by many elbows. The entry was short because ink is expensive and mercy prefers verbs to adjectives. Took sanctuary, crown wedged, stealing amare. Date, after Compline. The priest put his seal, impressing wax like a slow red heartbeat, and the bell struck once with that particular tone bells used for news that is quiet on purpose. Outside, the watch looked relieved to have a procedure to lean on. Sanctuary did not argue innocence. It argued pause. The kingdom, for all its opinions and boots, accepted that even a hot pursuit could cool itself on a church doorstep. Behind the door, the world organized like a camp the size of a chapter. Morning was bread, straw, a clean corner, and a conversation about fear pitched at a responsible volume. The cook did not ask questions, but produced porridge with the discretion of a librarian. The sacristan showed the necessary map. This line is the threshold. Do not cross it unless you wish to return to being a headline. In some churches, the limits were painted in a neat band along the floor. In others, the boundary was explained by a gesture so practiced it had become a small dance. The petitioner could move within these lines as freely as thought can pace in a cell. He could pray, count the beams in the roof until they memorized him back, and help pump the bellows if the blacksmith's boy was late again. Every hour had a chore stitched to it. The sweep of stone step and nave seam. the carrying of water from a pump that coughed like an ancestor, the polite folding of bedding that thought it was a mat. Petitions for alms were sent to the town across the threshold in baskets with faces that had seen many errands. Coins came as they always do, with stories attached you are not allowed to read. The petitioner ate what the sacristy ate, which means a liturgical relationship with onions and a cheerful tolerance for broth. If children came to stare, and they did, because curiosity walks faster than rumor, someone set them to work winding skeins, which slows even the fastest biography. Visitors arrived at the porch to provide breath to the record. An advocate explained how law stacks itself like winter wood. A kinsperson brought a spare shirt that was cleaner because it was newer, and also advice that was not. A notary pointed to the doorway and said, very gently, that it was both protection and a decision machine. The town constable, who had the expression of a cartwheel that has hit many stones and will hit many, more nodded to the priest and then argued politely with the door by writing the petitioner's name outside it in large letters. When evening came, the petitioner learned the liturgy of listening, the choir of pages being turned the murmur of Latin that sounds like weaving loom, the clock of your own heart, when no other clock will tell you the hour. 40 days is the number the rule prefers, which tells you something about the rule's taste in stories. It is long enough to teach a habit how to sit, not long enough to knit a very large sweater. The calendar lived on a wax tablet that was impressed and smoothed so many times it had learned to be a tie. Every morning the porter drew a line, and everyone pretended time is a straight thing. The petitioner grew shaved or unshaved, depending on the local school of thought regarding fugitives and razors. He learned which priest liked a quick game of tables after Vespers, and which monk could be coaxed into discussing the correct name for the small iron hook that keeps doors believing in themselves. He learned which window offered a sliver of sky that performed unusual theater at noon. Once or twice, a coroner came. Coroners were precise whether in human form. They arrived, measured, and wrote. He would stand just so that his shadow did not trespass, and ask for the confession in a voice neither officer nor uncle. If guilt was owned, yes, it was the mare. The coroner wrote that down too, and everyone looked at the floor in a respectful way, as if truth requires a moment to be alone with itself. He explained the two roads. One road led out the door. It had cobbles, a jury, a trial, a sentence, a possible return. The other road also led out the door. It ended at a churchyard with a straight line in it. Between them, sanctuary offered 40 sleeps to decide which fit best in the petitioner's pocket. Decision-making in sanctuary is a craft with no fast options. The petitioner rehearsed speeches to an imaginary judge until the imaginary judge grew bored with eloquence. He weighed reputations as if they were coins and not opinions. He watched wind moving dust along the sunlit part of the nave, and sometimes that helped. On certain days, his guilt felt like a stone worn into an almost comfortable shape by the slow river of apology. On others, it felt sharp, and the river forgot how to move. A priest recommended the traditional exercise: walk the boundaries slowly with both hands tucked behind your back, which makes you look like a thoughtful bishop and also prevents accidental stepping into problems. At night, he dreamed an inventory: 1 ring of iron, 1 book of hours, 1 courage, borrowed, to be returned at dawn. Outside the line, life kept clattering. Markets invented rumors at an impressive rate. Artisans debated the properties of glue. A pig, unacquainted with theology, wandered under the church eaves and had to be escorted by a boy who enjoyed the job so much he considered going professional. The watch leaned their halberds against the porch and let them rest like old relatives between dances. Occasionally, a neighbor made a scene people liked to perform for thresholds. One woman shouted that the petitioner had taken more than a mare. He had taken a promise. The priest allowed exactly 3 sentences of this and then conducted a very slow closing of the door, which is the church version of a polite yawn. As days moved, the petitioner's ledger of small knowledge grew. He learned that the bell rope smells different in rain, that a candle flame can be a better sermon than an entire sermon if you're counting breaths, that straw is a remarkable historian. It records every toss and turn. He learned to read the monks' faces during psalms about safety unlock certain eyebrows. He watched the little economy of mercy and wrote it in his head. 1 tin mug, 1 quarter loaf, 1 hand the size of forgiveness, 1 cat who believes in no borders. When the 40th morning fattened the candle mark on the wax, the rule stood up again. There is an hour for deciding, and it does not enjoy being moved. So the petitioner's name was spoken in the porch, and the options were placed on a table that had carried many options before and had no preference among them. Some chose the court. They stepped out into robes of daylight and into a town that wore its opinions like aprons. Some chose the oath known to clerks in riverboats, the long goodbye called abjuration. The oath is tidy. You swear to leave the realm, on foot, by a route that has existed for so long it has learned to be patient with feet. The oath begins like a very narrow ceremony. Bareheaded, hand on gospel, you swear and promise to travel directly to a named port, touching only the king's highway, avoiding taverns and friends, and the kind of sideways that turns a straight path into a story. The coroner lists the gates you will pass through as if they are beads on a strand. He gives you a wooden cross, not for piety especially, but so that everyone you meet will know that law is already traveling with you. It is a portable sign that says, "I am leaving." Please do not make it more interesting than it needs to be. There is, of course, a map. The church provides it in the style of a recipe. Go out this door, turn toward St. Stephen's Cross the bridge, where the alewife calls her dog, follow the road that children call Dragon Lane, because it does not look like a dragon at all, and continue in sincerity. If there is a river, you are to keep it on your wrong hand. If there is a hill, you are to let it happen to you without complaint. Somewhere a clerk who loves lists more than sleep notes these instructions in a book for the satisfaction of future clerks. The path is not chosen for scenery. It is chosen so that no one has to think too hard. Watchmen escort you to the first gate. They are gracious because formality is a kind of mercy. One carries a staff that has opinions. One carries a lantern that has wind. They accept small food from the church kitchen and stick it in pockets that remember previous sandwiches. At the gate, the guard smiles the tired smile of a person who has seen many beginnings. He gestures with 2 fingers, the international sign for there, and then he closes the city behind you with a sound that suggests final punctuation. Walking a kingdom with a wooden cross has a way of simplifying your conversational needs. When you pass a village, people look up from things that involve strings and steam, and they nod because the cross explains everything worth explaining. Sometimes a curious child walks with you for a while and tells you facts about geese. Sometimes a dog appoints itself logistics coordinator. You sleep in wayside chapels with walls that have listened to more feet than voices, on straw that has already heard the ostens of times, and for this reason is very good at not interrupting. In the morning you rise, and the road continues to be itself. It offers the customary list of surfaces, dust, mud, gravel, piety, and it escorts you through a landscape that is not interested in your drama, but very invested in your ankles. At each appointed town, the coroner as counterpart writes down that you have come and that you are going. Came hither with the cross at none, says one hand. Departed toward the west at vespers, says another. This is how the realm keeps time with your feet instead of clocks. You are linked in a book. You become a measurement people recognize. A woman selling turnips says, "There goes an oath," the way one might say, "There goes the weather. No one is unkind." In this particular kind of bureaucracy, kindness is the easiest paperwork. When you reach the sea, it is largely water, which is relieving, because sometimes metaphor gets in the way. The harbor clerk scratches his head and says the language of ships, which includes promising that a vessel will absolutely depart tomorrow and possibly keep to its course if the wind continues to behave like an obedient cushion. You wait with other departures, some with crosses, some with packages, one with a chicken who disapproves of all policy. Your cross stands in the crowd like a spare mast. The purser counts spaces and pretends to count souls. A friar who has come for alms mutters something about Jonah and then remembers your oath contains no fish. Departure is not dramatic. It is paperwork with waves. You board. The cross is left on the shore, a little memorial to the conversation between door and law. The ship learns your weight and adjusts. The town becomes a watercolor and then a rumor and then not even that. England or France, or whichever country has lent you its roads, slides behind you like a page turning itself. You become someone else's stranger. This also is part of the rule. To end a trouble without growing a new one where everyone already knows your name. Back at the doorway, people tidy the memory of you. The ledger acquires a final line, abjured, bound for Dover. The wax is pressed once more and cools with the mild sigh a seal makes when it has done its best. The porter sweeps the threshold, which collects everything thresholds collect. Dust, leaves, a feather that has briefly pretended to be a miracle, the sole half of a dried pea. The ring worms with mourning and prepares for its next discussion with the world. The children who watched you leave return to counting steps in the nave because it is a satisfying number. Sanctuary leaves traces but not messes. The bench where you sat to fold and refold your decision keeps a small shine where your hands buried its edge. The straw remembers your shape and then politely forgets it. The cook puts a clean tin mug back on the peg that says guest, as if a label can make anything less heavy. The priest folds the writs and places them in the chest where humility and bureaucracy share a shelf. In the town, a neighbor tells the story, and then the story chooses a more interesting hat, and then it goes traveling. Someone hears a version in which you confess to stealing the moon, which is majestic, if inaccurate. Sometimes a petitioner dies within the line. It is not the plan, but life keeps its own lists. When that happens, the rule does not collapse in confusion. It changes rooms and continues its work. The body is kept within the church until relatives arrive or cannot. The bell tolls in the method designed for death because sound has good manners. The coroner writes what can be written. The grave is dug in a place that knows what to do. The ledger adds a quiet line with a lot of small letters. A door that has stopped the law knows how to open to let someone out. Sometimes a petitioner changes his mind on day 28 and again on day 33, and then repeatedly for an afternoon while a storm holds a committee meeting on the roof. This is considered normal. The human heart is not a clock. It is a flock. The priest has a sermon for storms like that, and it is mostly silence. When the decision is finally made, it is not dramatic. It has the color of rainwater and the flavor of bread. The paperwork is written with clear hands. Mercy prefers legible ink. Over the centuries, sanctuary grew narrower and then absent, the way a river does when new ditches are cut. Cities learned gaslight and confidence. Courts learned speed. Doors remembered because wood does. Some knocker rings were replaced by replicas made by people who care about the exact curl of a lion's lip. Guides show the iron ring with the voice used for delicate fossils. Children still touch it because children are excellent at museums. The idea that a person may press pause and the world must listen still lives in other forms. A hand raised in a meeting. A white flag the way you can put your forehead to a window and feel the house agree to hold you for a minute. Records continue to sleep their paper sleep. Paid to the beetle for the warming of the petitioner. Paid for candles burned past hours while the coroner wrote. Paid for bread, coarse, thrice. These lines are small and unbelievably gentle. A separate note remarks that the ringer was asked to toll once, only once, on account of talk in the town. You can hear the conversation inside that sentence if you tilt it to the light. Another entry announces an abjurer who made it to the port, and then straight back again under another name. The clerk wrote, he was recognized by a birthmark shaped like a comma, and you can tell the clerk felt kinship with punctuation. If you stand in such a porch now, the stone will give you its temperature. The ring will eye you with forged patience. You can practice the tiny bell people used to give thresholds, which costs nothing and pleases architecture. Imagine the knock at midnight, the bolt drawn back, the slow occupation of a space by a life that needed a corner to think in. Imagine the 40 marks on the wax tablet, smoothed out each morning as if doubt were a beach. Imagine the path to the port, with its catalog of gates and its one polite purpose. Imagine the ledger closing at last with a soft breath, like a book that loves its shelf. And then imagine sleep arriving the same way sanctuary does. Not a verdict, not an argument won, but a door held open by a rule older than worry. You set down the day, its accusations, its plans, its cleverly rehearsed speeches, and you step across the line. There are blankets and a low flame and the distant sound of clerks whispering to ink. There's a bell that will strike once more, very faintly, because someone must keep the calendar honest. The ring keeps watch, cool as law and warm as custom. You drift, and the house writes a tiny entry about it in its ledgers. Slept without a rest. Woke with a lighter face, and outside, the street continues, politely, to be the street. You might not expect 3 barleycorns to have a say in your shoes, but they did, and they did it so modestly that hardly anyone thanked them. A barleycorn, if you haven't had the pleasure, is exactly what it sounds like, except that in English law, it lived a double life as a very small ruler. Stack 3 of them end to end, and you have an inch. Stack 12 inches, and you have what you already suspect. Stretch 3 of those, and a yard will quietly arrive like a coat hung on a peg. The pleasing part is how all of this pretended to be natural while being, in fact, a social agreement held together by habit, oaths, and several cupboards full of metal sticks. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe or don't. The yard will remain the yard either way, and I will keep talking softly about people measuring things until sleep makes better use of your time. The first scene begins where most measurements begin, which is with a body trying to be a calendar. A foot belongs to someone, a cubit belongs to someone else's elbow, and a pace belongs to a person walking in a hurry and insisting they are not. Markets need a quieter truth than all that. So early clerks wrote lengths into the law like they were prayers. The inch as 3 barleycorns, dried and round, chosen because barley declines to be dramatic about its size. The foot as 12 of those inches because 12 is the friendliest number in the room, dividing itself into tidy fractions for bakers, sailors, and people who need thirds on short notice. Somewhere a reeve cut a rod to exactly 16.5 feet, and everyone treated it like a sensible joke that got out of hand. Across England, the rod met the furlong 40 of those rods, pressed nose to tail, and a furrow of plowed field reluctantly became a unit of distance. The way a sigh becomes a proverb if people repeat it enough. There is a rural rhythm to early accuracy. A king promises that a yard is the distance from his nose to hitch thumb, and the yard lasts longer than the king. In the sheriff's chest, the standard owl sleeps in a velvet sleeve like an aristocratic snake. Cloth is sold by its permission, and it has the sort of face that makes weavers behave. Chapmen traveling with packs of ribbons and needles carry folding measures that remember many elbows. On market days, disputes over inches are settled with a ceremony of straight faces. The seller's yard is compared to the guild's yard, and the guild's yard, if insulted, enjoys telling long stories about charters. An alehouse keeps a chalked line on a doorpost for regulars who swear a fish was this long, then amend the chalk after a second pint. Meanwhile, the barleycorns do their quiet multiplication in boots and cobbler's ledgers, leaving small arithmetic in every footprint. Accuracy increases whenever money begins to notice it. Fairs learn that a short yard sells more cloth. Governments learn that a long yard sells more tax. Somewhere in the 14th century, a clerk makes a remark about the perch, and a surveyor becomes suddenly very busy tying knotted cords. A cord is good because it stores easily and makes you feel biblical. It is bad because knots have opinions. So they tie them tight, soak them, and swear at the sun when the cord dries, and suddenly the field is several inches shorter than it used to be, which affects the rent in a way the tenant can hear. In response, towns keep measuring rods inside churches, where humidity is polite and people are less likely to whittle them into a shepherd's crook on a slow afternoon. It is a strange but effective arrangement. Property across the parish depends on a piece of wood leaning next to a saint. The second scene comes in with boots and chain. In the 17th century, Edmund Gunter designs a chain that decides to be famous. It is 100 links long, each link very nearly 7.92 inches, because 10 and 60 are getting married on the lawn, and the chain wants both sides of the family invited. Surveyors fall in love immediately because the chain lets you think in acres without blushing. 10 square chains make an acre, a number that sits on the tongue like a biscuit, and 80 chains make a mile, which is true enough to count as a fact even when the ground is impatient. Surveying parties travel like small orchestras, 2 chainmen, a flagman, a note-taker, and a senior person whose main job is to frown at hedges. They stretch the chain as if the earth were a wrinkled bed that needs smoothing, and the links whisper to one another in a language of wear. The chain becomes the empire's favorite necklace, draped over commons and colonies, counting while it pretends to be walking. With chains comes paperwork that is almost tender. Field books list hedgerow oaks by attitude, stubborn, leaning, excellent, because trees are reference points with personalities. Bearings are noted from a compass that has learned to be calm near iron. Distances are written in chains and links in a script that looks like a disciplined meadow. The maps that result behave like gossip with good manners. They remember where the ditch actually is, they recall who thinks they own it, and they know exactly how far the well is. From the sycamore where people prefer to argue, anyone who has tried to divide an inheritance realizes why precision is basically a kindness that saves dinners from becoming court cases. In the colonies, long straight boundaries are drawn using chains between places where the land is not at all interested in straightness. Later generations stare at the map and wonder why a border respects neither mountain nor river. The answer is that a clerk in a chain had a good day. Back in London, the yard is developing a talent for surviving disasters. In 1756, the government makes a perfect yard from brass, which is a metal that likes to be both stubborn and polite. It is placed in the exchequer, which is the medieval word for a building that keeps promises in drawers. Ensuring the drawer promises do not accidentally get longer in summer and shorter in winter becomes a kind of national hobby. There are copies of the yard and copies of the copies, and certified affidavits that a particular bar is exactly what it says it is. Then, of course, there is a fire, because fires love a good archive. In 1834, the Houses of Parliament burn, and with them, among other celebrities, the official yard melts into a puddle with excellent documentation. It is replaced by a new standard, carefully engineered with notches and gold plugs that shrink and swell less than most metals, because gold has a relaxed attitude toward drama. These bars have engraved dots, so that the true yard is not the bar, but the space between 2 invisible planes touching those dots. It is a very British solution. The essence of the thing exists just next to it. The third scene finds scientists developing a crush on France. Across the channel, the meter has been defined from the Earth itself, measured from the pole to the equator along a meridian that took surveyors so long to map. They learned patience as a second language. The result is a platinum iridium bar locked in a vault, guarded by good intentions and a committee. The meter is lovely, and it arrives with decimals that line up like soldiers on parade. It is also French in a way that makes British administrators sip their tea rather pointedly. For decades, Britain and America continue with their inches and yards, now defined by very accurate bars owned by very responsible men, while quietly keeping a weather eye on the meter, which looks frankly convenient. Toolmakers live in the two worlds at once. A Whitworth thread leanly translates inch pitches into real bolts. A French engineer draws a millimeter line, and the draftsman's hand smiles. Somewhere a machinist stops the argument by tapping the bar and saying, "Metal does not care how you pray, only that you say the prayer the same way each time." Manufacturers become a kind of clergy for the inch. Gauge blocks, small steel rectangles lap so flat that two of them cling together like shy. Magnets create stacks that build lengths with a confidence not even kings can manage. A machinist rings them, pressing surfaces so honest they refuse to admit air between them, and the stack becomes an inch and a half with the moral authority of granite. In workshops, the micrometer develops a bedside manner. It touches and reads, whispers a number, and moves on. The inch leaves the fields of barley corn and takes an apartment in industry, surrounded by calipers and surface plates that say please and thank you to one another with every measurement. On factory floors, chopped lines become scribed lines, and chalk arguments become tolerances. Fitters speak of thousandths of an inch in the same tone shepherds used for weather, and the world becomes a place where close enough is refined from a shrug into a specification. Even everyday life grows a measuring habit. Tailors keep wooden rulers that know the names of shoulders. Haberdashers sell tape measures wrapped like licorice in metal tins. Kitchen tables accumulate yardsticks with advertisements for feed stores and paint. And children learn that a yard has a delightful trick. It is longer than you expected just a moment ago. People measure mantelpieces for clocks that always arrive slightly wider than the mantelpiece remembers being. Postal clerks glide letters into slots that decide their fate by width. If the letter refuses, the clerk says large with both sympathy and triumph. And still, beneath all that, there are barley corns in your shoes, behaving exactly as they did when they were plants, which is to take the sun and make a unit out of it. The last scene is where the yard and the meter finally nod to each other like two old neighbors who decided long ago to share a fence and not discuss it. In 1959, engineers across the English-speaking world agree that an inch will be exactly 25.4 millimeters. The drama, such as it is, fits easily on a postcard. No parliaments catch fire, no chains are relinked. A few draftsmen erase a table, sigh with satisfaction, and never look back. Officially, the yard becomes 0.9144 meters for significant figures that settle into textbooks like a cat finding a warm stack of laundry. The conversion is so neat that it feels like it had been waiting for every previous argument to grow tired. The brass bars still exist, of course. They are relics now, relics that continue, unfairly, to be extremely good at their job. In laboratories, meanwhile, the game changes completely. Light, which once kept kindly company with candles and saints' days, is asked to hold a ruler. The meter becomes the distance light travels in a tiny slice of a second, and time joins length in an arrangement that makes philosophers nod and shrug. A laser sings a note, and from that note, engineers tune their instruments. Somewhere a team calibrates a machine using interference fringes that look like the ghosts of well-behaved zebras. The inch is still there, right next to all of this, peacefully defined by the meter, which is defined by light, which is defined by time, which is defined by cesium atoms pretending to be a choir. If this hierarchy makes you sleepy, that is appropriate. Standards are lullabies for scientists. For all that splendor, life remains endearingly small. A carpenter snaps a chalk line and flicks it once geometry with a satisfying sound. The line becomes a wall that later learns the dimensions of a bookcase that never quite fits its intended books, because books multiply in ways architects refuse to legislate. A gardener lays out a bed with a tape measure and then ignores it, trusting plants to perform their own math. A teacher writes 12 in equals 1 foot on a board and watches a classroom discover that inches were designed by someone who liked fractions for dessert. In a museum case, a brass yard bar rests on crystal rollers under a glass lid that fits so well you can hear the installers still complimenting themselves. A label explains that the dots at either end are the yard, not the bar. Children press their noses to the glass, and the guard, who has heard every question, says gently that no, we do not take it out to see how long it feels. There are tender absurdities everywhere. Early shoemakers used the stick measure, which could be a literal stick, which is both endearing and problematic when someone trims it for the fire. Tailors wrote yard and nail, the nail being 2 1/4 inches, which sounds like a joke until you pay for cloth and realize it is a joke that costs money. In some towns, the parish kept a standard bushel in a locked box and brought it out like a relic on market days, which meant grain was measured under the same ceiling where marriages were promised and bell ropes were repaired. The 19th century London Board of Trade owned a traveling chest of standards that could visit a recalcitrant shopkeeper and put right a dishonest scale with a wooden face that said, essentially, please behave. Somewhere, an inspector carrying a set of weights like a polite brick quells a fight between 2 men about treacle, which is the most British sentence available. What is beautiful, if you enjoy that sort of beauty, is how measurement chooses its homes. It hides in guild halls and workshops, in the folds of surveying outfits, in the notebooks of lighthouse keepers who measured their steps to make sure the oil reached the top before dark. It lives in the pocket of a railway clerk whose job is to verify that freight fits the loading gauge by sliding a shy metal frame around it like a hug. It nestles in the mind of a baker whose hand knows exactly how wide to roll a crust because the crust told her so last Thursday and she listened. It is an argument settled before supper. It is a sigh of relief written in numbers. Sometimes accuracy writes comedy. An engineer drafts a bracket with holes spaced at exactly 1 inch. The factory reads approx, and the holes are exactly 1 inch apart in 3 different directions. A sign maker receives instructions in millimeters, owns only a tape in inches, performs arithmetic that would make a numismatist cry, and produces letters that fit by accident and by grace. A homeowner learns that a 2x4 is not 2x4. It is a problem of forestry and planing and the difference between what lumber is called and what lumber actually is, and somewhere a long dead barleycorn shakes its head affectionately. If tonight you set a book on the nightstand and notice that the book is a little less than a foot, you have found a bridge between a field of barley and a laboratory of light. The inch is an old friend that learned new manners. The meter is a new friend that learned old jokes. Somewhere there is still a brass bar asleep in a drawer, resting on crystal, visited by keys and footfalls and the breath of docents. Somewhere a surveyor's chain hangs like a well-traveled necklace, every link remembering a morning with dew. Somewhere a clerk is neat hand copies 0.9144 meters into a regulation for the 1000th time and smiles because his pencil has already learned the curve. The lovely, boring truth is that nothing dramatic happens to most measurements. They prefer to be embedded in other people's business. They show up in curtains and furniture, in bolt patterns and passport booths, in legroom and letters, and most of all in the space between thumb and forefinger when you say, about this much. Each one is a handshake with the past and a nod to tomorrow's invoices. Each one is a promise that the table will fit through the door, though not without a slight angle and a felt pad. And now, as the room grows quieter than numbers normally allow, the barleycorns can return to their peaceful conspiracy. The inch will sleep with its thousands tucked in like kittens. The yard will remember the king's arm, then the brass bar, then the invisible planes, grazing gold plugs and sigh contentedly into 0.9144 meters, with all the contentment of a unit that knows it will be let into any workshop by name. The chain will dream of fields that looked bigger at sunrise. Somewhere a laser hums a single note into a dark, clean space, measuring the distance to a mirror so patiently that time itself blushes. You may close your eyes now. The world has been counted well enough for one night. You might not expect a bronze door knocker to change the course of a trial, but on certain nights it did, and it did so with an admirably small clunk. The lion's head on the church door did not roar. It merely kissed the iron plate in a sound that meant the law must pause and listen. One touch, one ring, and the world outside slowed down to the rhythm of candles and choir stalls. If you're still awake by the time we get to the official inventory of straw, you can subscribe if that seems restful. But honestly, don't strain yourself. The door will wait. The law can wait. Even the bell knows how to take its time. The claim began, as these things often did, not with a speech but with breathing. A figure, usually damp, sometimes limping, always purposeful, crossed the churchyard like a sentence crossing a page. The night clerk, who knew everything about hinges and almost nothing about drama, heard the knock and reached for a small lantern with the affection reserved for a reliable domestic pet. The phrase was formal, even in whispers, sanctuary for God and his house. No one tested the acoustics. They simply repeated the words until the words felt true. The door opened not grandly, but like any door that has been opened thousands of times. A bead of wax on a portable candle left a dot in the record keeper's book where it should not have, which is how we know the pen hesitated. Once the threshold was crossed, the strange clock began. 40 days said custom and not a poet's 40. The jailer's 40. The ledger's 40. The clerk noted the day with a neat line and a cautious ink blot. Like a ship placing itself at anchor dot, there were rules, and they always sounded older than they actually were. No weapons, no quarrels, no foot crossing that line unless the law remembered its manners and asked permission. The threshold was the thin border between a town that liked to hurry and a church that enjoyed finishing sentences. It is pleasant to imagine that the stones felt different. On one side, market cries, the creak of carts, the gossip about a goose that belonged to two different families. On the other, voices that had practiced keeping the same pitch for 40 years. Sanctuary did not announce innocence. It announced time. It announced that until the candles agreed to burn down to a mark in the wax dish, nothing decisive would happen. Even the wind seemed to adopt correct posture, as if it had wages to lose. Inside the lines, life resized itself to fit a nave. Morning was not a sunrise so much as the sound of the sacristan rubbing a thumb along a candlestick to check for drips. The suppliant, this was the politely complicated word, received bread and sometimes cheese, sometimes none, depending on the state of the abbey dairy and who had annoyed whom at vespers. A pallet appeared, made of reeds that had been skeptical about becoming a bed. Straw is dignified if you let it lie still. It was recorded that way too in simple arithmetic. 1 bundle on Monday, half a bundle when the cart broke its way in the mud, 2 bundles when a generous widow insisted, and the ledger remembered her name because ledgers are good at gratitude in a small font. A volunteer watcher sat within sight of the threshold and the suppliant, a job that involved equal parts compassion and staying awake. The watcher did not judge, not allowed. The watcher counted time with a wooden bead on a cord and tried not to cough during psalms. The world outside the door did not stop entirely. Of course. People visited, and they brought their eyebrows. A cousin came with a story that grew a few inches every day, like a vine that had found a fence. A neighbor who disapproved of the entire concept of sanctuary nevertheless arrived each afternoon to inspect the rules. The way some people review recipes they don't intend to cook. The officer of the town came in carefully, as if the flagstones might object, and read aloud a note that said words like charge and indictment, while his breath smoked in the nave like someone's shy incense. The priest answered with the language of doors and thresholds, which officially belonged to the church, but had been generously lent to everyone for the week. A bell was rung, not for beauty, but for bureaucracy, and it sounded exactly like a spoon touched gently to a glass at a quiet wedding. The suppliant listened, the watcher watched, and the ledger acquired the day's modest paragraph, what people asked, in low voices because low voices travel well, was whether the law had stumbled or merely paused. The answer was always that the law had sat down on a bench and agreed to eat something simple. Within these lines, the suppliant could not be arrested and the city would not be insulted by it. Time itself was the offense and the defense. Some nights there was singing, which proves almost nothing in court, but quite a lot in kitchens. In the mornings, the choir's breath condensed on the colder stones and then vanished, like opinions that had learned discretion. Somewhere, someone new to town asked why the floor contained brass plaques with names, and someone older answered that the floor remembered what the town kept forgetting. The sanctuary clock ticked without hands, measuring days in the distance between new wax and old wax. After the first week, when the novelty had folded itself neatly and taken up less space, the rhythm took over. It was not excitement. It was persistence. The suppliant had chores. This detail pleases the historian and makes everyone else nod sleepily. The chores were modest and telling. Sweep the aisle, carry kindling for the boiler that softened the starch in the choir robes. Walk with the watcher to the cloister garden and not look at the gate that led to the alley. Once, a traveling mason sold the church a length of rope to mark the suppliant's permitted range. He swore it was pre-measured to 40 paces. Which it was, although the paces belonged to a man with notably short legs. This error persisted happily for years. The rope became an amiable liar, and no one minded. On certain afternoons, an official conversation took place between the suppliant and someone whose job title sounded heavier than it felt: the advocate, the commissary, the clerk of the peace. These meetings happened at the threshold, because thresholds like to be useful. The questions were predictable and were written down with the sort of care usually reserved for weighing spices. Did the suppliant understand the terms? Yes. Did the suppliant wish to depart and stand trial? Not just yet. Would the suppliant consider abjuring the realm? A wonderful phrase that tastes like old iron and means leaving everything behind for a road that does not come back. The suppliant stared at the lion-head knocker, which stared back because that is a knocker's professional obligation. Opinions like crows drifted along the roof and peered down. The ledger made a note about the weather. 40 days is either too short or too long, depending on whether you are counting yourself or hoping someone else will. As the mark approached, the conversation sharpened like pencils. Decide or be decided, said the law, gently this time, like a constable used to holding doors open for elderly neighbors. Standing trial would swiftly convert the pew into a plank. Abjuring the realm would convert the church into a road. There was also the third path, which existed in the wise shrug of the priests: settlement. A fine paid by someone who could raise it, an apology folded into a bargaining shape that could stand on its own, a family pack scribbled on the back of an old sermon. Settlement happened more often than the records admit, because records love clarity and settlements love compromise. Somewhere the town's baker sent a loaf with caraway seeds as a peace offering, a detail recorded only in the memory of the door, which is not an authorized source. When abjuration was chosen, the ceremony was plain in the way bread is plain, essential, deliberate, without garnish. A cross was held. An oath was spoken in words that would rather not be paraphrased. A route was named gate to gate, cross to cross, river to bridge, and the city agreed to see the traveler that far and no further. The road refused to bend. No alehouses were allowed to be friendly, which is an unusual demand to make of alehouses, but they learned to keep their faces still. Townspeople gathered not to jeer, but to count quietly, because counting has always been a civic hobby. The suppliant walked with a narrow dignity that belongs to people doing arithmetic with their future. At the last gate, the officers who had been stern became kindly in a way the law permits only at distances. Once beyond the line, they turned back, as if the town itself were a dog instructed to stay. When standing trial was chosen, the tone changed without the pitch changing. There were lists of names and copies of lists, copies of copies. Witnesses rehearsed their answers in kitchens and then tried to say them exactly, the same way in court, and almost never succeeded. The sanctuary did not render a verdict. It only sent the defendant in with sleep behind the eyes instead of fear. Some lost, some won. Many ended up at the same tavern afterward with different expressions and the same barley stew. The tavern keeper knew not to ask. The sanctuary door, having performed its night work, went back to opening for Sunday dot. The marks left behind were small and content to be small. A patch of wax on the threshold refused to wear down as fast as its neighbors. An entry in the church accounts shows a spool of thread and a needle for the cloth of a stranger, which is perhaps too elegant a phrase for a borrowed shawl. A brass dish used for counting alms has a tiny nick that was not there the previous year, caused by the corner of a badge the suppliant wore while walking the permitted rope's length. And a parish chest there is a note from a sheriff acknowledging receipt of a person to be led to the bridge, written in the tidy script of someone who once won a prize for penmanship and never stopped celebrating. The townspeople retained a mild habit of avoiding the exact flagstone where the oath had been spoken, not for fear, but for the decent superstition that keeps us from stepping on a child's chalk drawing, even after rain has moved it into language. The law did not admire the system, though it politely pretended to. Over the centuries, rules tightened like belts after a large meal. In some places, sanctuary shrank to the length of an altar's shadow. In others, it became a scheduled courtesy during daylight hours with a clerk present and a pot of tea. Cities grew impatient. Officials disliked being told to wait by a wall. Yet the practice refused to vanish all at once. The way a familiar hymn lingers in the air even after the organist closes the lid. When it eventually did fade, it left behind habits that had learned to be independent. The idea that delay might be a form of justice rather than its enemy. The belief that thresholds deserve respect. The stubborn notion that a community, when given 40 days of breathing room, often invents a solution that was not visible at a running pace. There are margins the records do not fill, and they are the most reliable parts. Did the supplicants sleep well? Sometimes. Did they talk to the lionhead knocker as if it could answer? Almost certainly. Did any of them count the tiny ribs inside the metal mouth and wonder whether the foundryman had been thinking about teeth? I hope so. The documents prefer to say 1 loaf, but someone baked it. And someone remembered that raisins are comforting if you pretend not to be surprised by them. The watchers wrote their initials in pencil in a hymn book's margin, where some are still faintly visible. The letters look like small fences, built for very well-behaved sheep. When you visit a church that once held sanctuary, and many did, more than you might think, there's rarely a plaque with a dramatic sentence. You can find the door, though, without help. It will be heavier than it needs to be, as if it remembers jobs you cannot see. The knocker may be new. The stain in the wood beneath, it may be old. Inside, a chill hovers in the aisle, even in summer, but it is a cooperative chill, the kind that keeps you company rather than asks for a coat. If you breathe carefully, you can hear the ledger turning its pages, pleased to be consulted again. If you put your palm down, you might locate the place where people stood still long enough to become part of the floor. The echo behaves well. The candles, if any, mind their manners. None of this changed the world at once. It changed the night. It allowed a town to postpone anger until morning, and then to postpone it again until the next morning. And often by the third morning, the anger had forgotten what to wear. The door did not forgive. It simply insisted on patience, which is, secretly, a cousin to forgiveness. The watchers kept watch, which is both a verb and a suggestion. The bell rang at the proper times. The market still opened on Tuesdays. Someone still argued about a boundary hedge on the hill, and the hedge continued being a hedge with admirable focus. If you are still listening, it means the door is doing its work. The night clerk has curled into the corner of the wooden chair designed by someone who had briefly met the concept of comfort and politely declined to pursue it. The ledger is closed, the candle trimmed, the straw shifted once and then left in peace. Outside, the street knows how to be quiet without being told. Inside, the Annie-chapel breathes like an animal asleep in the sun. 40 days is a span that fits into a nap if you give it a chance. Your own breathing can adopt the schedules of long-ago bells, measured and unhurried. And if you dream of a lion's head that knocks gently, that is all right. It is only the law learning for a few minutes how to wait with you. You might not expect the official weight of a loaf to lull a city into good behavior, but it did very slowly with flour in its hair. There was a time when town sounded like ovens cooling down, and the rhythm of that sound was set by the assize of bread and ale, a name that looks fierce on parchment and drowsy on the street. The rule was simple, and the way that bread is simple. The price of wheat went up and down. The allowed weight of a standard loaf went down and up. Nothing dramatic happened. A bell rang. A clerk counted. A baker nodded and kneaded. If you're still awake a few minutes from now, you can subscribe if you like. Think of it as stamping your loaf with a tiny seal of approval. But please don't hurry. Nothing about bread law has ever hurried and kept its dignity. The first detail is a scale, which is unsentimental and perfectly calm. It is made of iron, which does not care who is hungry and who is not, and two pans that care even less. In one pan there's a weight the town swears by. In the other pan there's a loaf that the town hopes for. The weight has a personality. All official weights do. It is called a stone, though it is not, and sometimes it carries the mayor's mark, or a tiny crown, or a leaf, because someone in the foundry had an artistic moment. The scale belongs to the market hall, to the guild, to whoever keeps a key in a pocket stitched extra deep. Once a week, or oftener if gossip rises, the inspector, he has many titles, and all of them sturdy, sets the pans trembling in the public eye. The crowd leans as one, a great communal tilt, as if to help the bread reach fairness by encouragement alone. The loaf settles, the weight settles, and the city breathes. On a lucky day, the pans rest level, which is the municipal equivalent of a lullaby. The rulebook travels by memory, by rumor, and by clean copies. A clerk writes the table fresh whenever wheat prices wobble. The table is lovely in its way. It says, if the quarter of wheat costs this many shillings, then the farthing loaf must weigh that many ounces. The numbers parade down the page like a family that always dresses alike for portraits. Next to them go notes in a smaller hand, the sort of handwriting you use when you are not entirely sure you will be thanked. Rain harmed the harvest. Sea wind blew chaff inland. The millstones want dressing. The last note appears in many places. It is not a spa treatment. It means roughening the face of the stone so it will bite the grain properly. A dull stone is a sleepy stone. Sleepy stones make coarse flour. Coarse flour makes citizens and sentences with sighs. Because the law believes in manners, it tells bakers to stamp their loaves. The mark can be a letter, a symbol, sometimes a picture. One town demanded that every baker choose an image easy to draw with tired hands. Crowns were popular, as were fishes and the occasional dog. In the Norfolk records, there is a loaf marked with a shovel, an honest self-portrait. Stamps make identity heavy in the crust, which is useful when the crust travels faster than its owner. If a loaf is found short of weight, the mark reports home without emotion. A constable sets the bread on the scale frowns, the loaf blushes at the edges, and the fee is levied. The town keeps a basket of offending bread for the poor, which is a soft form of poetry the law doesn't write on purpose. The oven is the scene and the instrument. A communal bakehouse is warm at all hours and intelligent in its heat. Even the ash settles with experience. The floor is sanded with a patience that comes from having a broom with only one story to tell. Bakers learn to hear the proper hollowness when a loaf is knocked. The quiet drum note at which starch is courage and crust is a promise. The assize does not care about artistry and theory, only mass, but mass enjoys being beautiful when it can. In every town there is one baker whose bread has an argument with the scale twice a year and wins on appeal because the crumb is a sermon. The inspector pretends to be stern and buys too. Now and then the absurd wanders in like a stray chicken. A town orders that no one may bake at night, not for fire safety, but because moonlight is thought to encourage sly loaves. Another requires bakers to sell the heel ends of yesterday's loaves at a reduced price to those who can produce a respectable shopping list. The phrase owl taster enters the minutes with a straight face. This person, elected in an atmosphere of public trust and private optimism, drinks small sips of beer all morning to ensure it is sold at the legal strength. It is exactly as satisfying as it sounds. Somewhere, surely, this is the first recorded instance of someone getting formally reprimanded for confusing quality with quantity. Inspections. Acquire routines as comfortable as old aprons. The officer brings the scale, the weights, and a stick marked with notches for measuring loaves that swell too ambitiously in one direction. The bakers bring trays and a public temperament. Children bring curiosity slightly disguised as errands. A woman with a wheelbarrow of cabbages brings opinions not disguised at all. The officer weighs, the crowd murmurs. The baker points out that steam has weight when it is inside bread, and not when it has drifted out to become wither. The officer agrees gravely. Everyone looks up at the rafters for the steam, just in case, and then looks down again at the numbers. The language of measures adds to the drowsy charm. A peck is not a bird, although it pretends to be. It is 2 gallons being serious. A quarter is not a fourth of anything obvious. It is 8 bushels, which is one of history's private jokes. Pounds are solid. Ounces are fretful. Drams are the sort of units that appear only when a clerk is bored enough to be precise and brave enough to be blamed. When the system converts from pounds to avoirdupois, the word itself makes everyone feel as if the butter might be French. A teacher spends an entire afternoon explaining to a group of apprentices that troy weight is for metal, not muffins, and sleeps well from the effort. When the metric age arrives centuries later, it offers grams and kilograms that line up obediently, and the nation considers this tidiness with suspicion. The law has 2 pockets, and both are full of patience. If the loaf is short, the fine is set. If the baker is repeatedly short, there are more creative options. In certain places, the town cart called the tumbrel, with a comfortable U waits by the square. The guilty baker sits in it for an hour in the company of the emptiest, lightest loaves, which like to travel, and the cart is pulled a ceremonial distance. This is not harsh so much as public. It is less humiliating than the fact that the geese always waddle behind. Believing a parade is a sign the town has finally acknowledged their leadership. Pillories are mentioned, rarely used, and mostly maintained for the civic pleasure of having something that needs oiling on a schedule. There are, of course, honest shortages. When harvests fail, the assize table performs an odd courtesy. Nothing gets cheaper, but the legal weight shrinks and the loaf, which cannot argue, abates. The decline is measured and gentle. Flour is sifted thinner. Crumbs become modest. The crust does more of the work. The poor households adapt with a professionalism learned from weather. They begin describing bread by thickness rather than count, which is more accurate anyway. The city makes lists of the truly hungry and sometimes remembers to check them twice. Almshouse kitchens add peas to everything and stir for a very long time. As if time itself were an ingredient, the pot-kneaded dot, sometimes the rule interrupts personal flair. A baker who prides himself on loaves shaped like missiles is asked to make rectangles for easier weighing. He capitulates with dignity and secretly tucks a tiny curved flourish into the corner. To prove to himself that style can live under supervision, an ambitious apprentice suggests adding honey to increase the weight honestly. The inspector reminds him that the size is about wheat and that massive sweetness is not a recognized path to justice. In one town, a baker is fined for warming his hands over the proofing trough, on the grounds that human heat is not an approved ingredient. The fine is small. The story is large. The town still tells it whenever a meeting is boring, which is its primary use. Red marks are small heraldry. A simple cross keeps company with initials, shields, and, for reasons only that family understands, a tiny turnip. The turnip family also marks their shutters with a turnip and their children with respectable names, which is a relief. Archaeologists later find stamps in muddy pits and feel improper joy. These bits of wood and metal are shy about being identified, but very friendly about being held. You can look at one and see, in a neat reversal, all the loaves it did not yet touch, and the mornings not yet measured by it. Museums put the stamps in small. Glass cases and the labels have the tone of someone pleased to have something that never did anyone any harm. The assize didn't just watch bread. It watched ale, which is a shorter story because ale finds its level with fewer arguments. The ale taster, diligent and rosy, check the measure first. The pot must hold what it promises. A quart that is only loyally quart-ish draws a reprimand. Then strength. Not too thin, lest the town be insulted. Not too strong, lest the town love itself into disorder. A dipper is a precise tool in trained hands, and the ale taster keeps a notebook that is more haiku than ledger. Good het, honest bitter, no complaints from the carpenter. New brewer, brave hop. Rainwater too proud. On feast days, the line between inspection and celebration becomes meaningfully fuzzy. The notes from such afternoons are unusually concise. Bread law, though sleepy, has a political life. Kings and councils publish national tables with gravity. Towns adjust them with local arithmetic and announce the results by ringing a bell that also serves for weddings and fires. Bakers may appeal to the guild, which sends a man with excellent shoes to argue that the millers have been extravagant with their fees. Millers appeal to the weather. Weather appeals to itself and offers no further comment. The governor of a prison records that prisoners are entitled to so many ounces of bread per day, unleavened or leavened, depending on mood and theology. No one asks the prisoners which they prefer. A bishop writes to a mayor recommending compassion. The mayor writes back recommending that the bishop try managing the price of salt for 1 week. Everyone uses the word prudent with the confidence of people who have located it on a map. In the ordinary lane where the ordinary ovens live, the law's presence is practical and invisible. The baker measures water by pitcher, salt by habit, yeast by companionship. If the dough smiles, as bakers say, you keep it. If the dough sulks, you start again and apologize to the bowl. At dawn, the line begins. Children arrive with orders pinned to sleeves. A soldier on leave buys a loaf, and the end is gone before he reaches the corner because his hand forgot to be disciplined. A widow bargains with the grace of someone who has never enjoyed haggling but has become good at it anyway. The inspector passes like a weather vane on legs, and everyone nods the way sailors nod to a lighthouse. It may not concern you today, but it is helpful that it exists. When the nation turns toward weights and measures with new intensity, this happens periodically because standardization feels like tiding the kitchen drawer bread is quietly instrumental. The official pound is checked against a master pound, kept in a box that opens only when two different keys are present in the same room at the same time, a ritual that manages to be both fussy and charming. The difference between a proper ounce and a lazy ounce is demonstrated to a polite crowd. The audience claps as if at a piano recital. Eventually, the land adopts solid rules with fewer regional jokes, and the assize, dignified elder that it is, steps aside slowly, like a great uncle leaving the dance floor whenever he hears music from after his century. Its habits remain. We still stamp bread, though the stamp is ink on a plastic bag now, announcing grams with the freshness of a well-sharpened pencil. We still distrust suspiciously light loaves and give them a squeeze in the aisle, because the human palm is an ancient instrument unbothered by calibration. We still keep, in the public imagination, a man or woman who might at any moment produce a scale and look at us meaningfully. We still think better of a city where bread and law have agreed to be friends. In certain towns, you can find the old market scales, no longer legal for trade. As the sign carefully says, decorating the wall of a pub, people hang their coats beneath them and feel, without thinking about it, a little safer. The records, fortunately for the insomniac and the quietly curious, preserve the tiny dramas. A baker fined for selling loaves of cunning hollowness. Another, exonerated because the inspector failed to allow for the loss of vapor during necessary cooling, which sounds like a philosopher's explanation for aging. A town forgiving debts in the hungry year, and the list of names written with a thicker pen, as if ink could be bread if it tried. In a Welsh parish, a note that a storm toppled the bakehouse chimney, and the loaves were carried to a neighbor's oven. With commendable speed and not inconsiderable merriment, it is restful to know that even during lawful panic, someone remembered to laugh in the right direction. There is, too, the grace of failure recorded politely. Sometimes a bakehouse burns. Sometimes an inspector is discovered using a weight that has been filed to an enthusiastic thinness. He is reassigned to counting fence posts, which is the civil service equivalent of standing in the corner. Once, a town adopts the metric system with full ceremony, and then continues to use the old measures in conversation because their mouths prefer the shape of the words. Nobody is punished. Language is a loaf that refuses to be sliced along new lines unless you ask very nicely. If you walk a market square early enough, you can see the law waking. The stones are wet, the shopkeepers' brooms make corduroy out of the street, and the day's first scale stands quietly in the doorway like a butler who has realized he is earlier than the guest. The baker lifts a test loaf with the formality of a minor rite. It is placed, not dropped. The weight meets it like an equal. The balance nods yes. The baker nods yes. The world nods along because the nod is contagious. Somewhere the ale taster, now called something sensible like an environmental health officer, checks the temperature of a fermenter with a tidy digital probe and writes a number that does not require a poem to explain it. The old and the new shake hands without either of them needing to grip strongly. The charm of such systems is that they are both overcomplicated and necessary. Loaves do not weigh themselves. Laws do not enforce themselves. People choose to live in towns where a line drawn on paper, translated into ounces, meets a loaf that knows how to be consistent. The baker devotes attention to dough that does not care about politics. The inspector, secretly a lover of pastry, enforces rules that keep him honest and his appetite second. The buyer brings a coin-worn pail by other hands and gets, in return, a weight that answers to its name. You might wonder about the taste, and the answer is reassuring. Regulations have a flavor, a mild calmness that resembles oats behaving themselves. When the city is tired or quarrelsome or blowing dust down every alley, a legal loaf shows up like a friend who owns a reliable kettle. Here, it says, with butter as the punctuation. Be precise later. Housewives cut slices with the seriousness of surveyors. Children who cannot be persuaded to care about bushels or buskers remember with eerie accuracy how much a slice should weigh if it is to support proper jam. And so the old assize drifts into the present day as a kind of institutional memory. Towns still like to imagine that if the scale were brought out again, the balance would be correct and the street would lean together and find the center. And the geese would appear at once with their opinions on ceremonial carts. In the end, the law about bread taught towns something gently radical, that the quiet details of life, how heavy, how fair matter enough to be argued over politely and solved in public. It is the sort of lesson that makes a community drowsy rather than excited. A loaf sits on a board. The board knows its weight by feel. The knife is honest. The hand is generous. The crumbs do that magical thing where they look like a small geography, and someone always eats the geography before a map can be drawn. If you're still awake, this is the moment when the oven door, long after the last batch, cools with a soft purr, the kind of sound iron makes when it decides it has done enough for one day. Somewhere a clerk closes a book that smells faintly of flour and ink and records that today's price of wheat requires tomorrow's loaf to weigh 1 ounce more, which is the sort of news even a pillow can handle. Bread will be there in the morning. The weight will be there. The scale will wait for both. The city, arranging itself for sleep, folds the recipe of fairness into the night, and the night accepts it kindly as if it too has always approved of a perfectly legal slice. You might not expect a city to trust its sleep to a piece of wood that spins and clicks like an overexcited cricket, but for a few centuries that was precisely the plan. The night watchman's rattle, sometimes as long as a forearm, sometimes the size of a generous sandwich, was the alarm clock you hoped would never ring, and the lullaby you paid taxes for anyway. It looked like a small paddle married to a cogwheel. When swung, the teeth flicked a slat and produced a clatter far louder than its humble parts suggested, the acoustic equivalent of shaking a cabinet of spoons. If you're still awake by the time I get to how many turns per minute a good rattle could manage, feel gently free to subscribe. Consider it the modern form of putting your porch candle in the window for the watch. But truly, don't exert yourself. The rattle never did. The tool began playing. A length of hardwood elm if you were practical. Boxwood if you were blessed with a cooperative budget and a fondness for polish, was carved to hold a spool with notches and a sprung. Tongue. 1 turn, 1 clack. 3 turns, a flurry. A full arm sweep, a storm. By day the thing looked almost comical, harmless as a toy that has lost its child. By night it had a purpose big enough to cover a street. The watchman's orders were direct and repetitive in the way that prevents both creativity and disaster. Pass each lane. Shout the hour. Show the light. Keep sober if you can. Rattle if you must. In some towns, the hour call came with weather, past 2 o'clock, and a fair quiet night. In others with civic optimism, 3 o'clock. All's well, even when all was not perfectly well. Because hope is a municipal virtue, The men who carried the rattles, occasionally women, more frequently older men whose knees, already mute cobblestones like cousins, learn of the city by the solace, not the map. They could tell you which alley made the lantern smoke, which drain whistled in east wind, which shopkeeper kept the neatest threshold sand, and where the bell of the parish clock actually lagged a full half-minute behind the steeple opposite, because the winder preferred his lunch to punctuality. Their coats were thick, not because the job required ceremony, but because the night repeatedly suggested that bones are better when wrapped. A staff marched with them, a hook at the end to tilt shutters, and an iron spike to test doors. The rattle sat in the pocket of the coat like a compact promise. The watch rounds were roots of habit threaded through roots of commerce. At midnight, it was butter and eels sleeping in their stalls. By 2 o'clock, the bakers were awake, which is one of history's favorite redundancies, a man who wakes in the night to make morning. If the watchman paused near an oven, his rattle warmed like a small animal. Wood is nothing if not suggestible. Past the river, ropes creaked, even when the water did not. An oar bumped against its fellow and apologized, then bumped again. The rattle gave a single preventive click, the bureaucratic equivalent of clearing a throat. Cats negotiate territory with the dignity of ambassadors. The watch stepped around them as around minor royalty. Rats made parallel, less dignified treaties. The city at night behaves like a drawer that the household believes closed. Everything inside keeps its rules anyway. Training was brisk. You were taught how to wind the rattle without taking your eyes off an alley, which is chiefly a matter of not winding it backward. Backward produces a noise like a spoon, sulking in a jar disappointing as an alarm and demoralizing as music. You were told how often to call the hour, and how far away voices carry on damp air, very, and why it matters to pace your shout so that the words arrive at a second-floor window as a sentence, rather than a series of startled exclamations. You were told to tuck the rattle under your arm when offering help. Nobody appreciates being comforted by percussion. You learn the small physics of sound, how an open carriage arch eats a clap, how a row of shutters gilts it and tosses it on, how a stone bridge adds a note you could not produce on purpose. A good watchman could locate his partner across 2 streets by tone alone. Sometimes the night required ceremony. A fire turned the rattle from warning to command. 3 men rattling together, an uneasy harmony, like 3 clocks intending to agree, could wake a square in under a minute. The pattern varied by town. One place taught, rattle, rattle, pause. Shout the street. Another preferred rattle until someone throws open a window and swears. Buckets appeared. Hands appeared, hats appeared, and an entire neighborhood negotiated itself into a line. The rattle would then retire to a supervisory role, held silent but visible, the authority of a whistle without the shrillness. When the last hiss of steam died, the watchman would give one soft turn, a punctuation mark for the flame sentence. Much of the work, as history likes to arrange such things, was gently absurd. The watch was tasked with quieting lovers, whose enthusiasm echoes in architecture even if nobody had planned for that. With escorting drunkards who disagreed with gravity, with reminding shutters that night air exists but strength of wood also exists, with chasing stray pigs who were, surprisingly often, wholly committed to the philosophical position that a lane belongs equally to citizen and pig. There are records of watchmen fined for leaning in doorways in a manner unbecoming of public guardians, a posture evidently defined by the angle at which the hat leaves the head. There is a case of a watchman who rattle-scared a flock of geese into organized retreat, which is to say, into advance in a different direction. He received a commendation written with an unusually cheerful pen. The rattle borrowed its authority from rules older than itself. Curfews, literally the cover fire bells, told households to bank their hearths. After that, The watch toured a city that had agreed to dim itself. The words used were small: hush, bank, quench, keep. When theology and law were friendly, the rattle did not sound on sacred nights without permission. When they were less friendly, permission was interpreted generously. A list survives of things that should not be rattle announced unless necessary. A comet, a troupe of foreign musicians, the arrival of a noble personage who prefers to be thought of as punctual rather than late. In such cases, the watchman was to knock with his staff and speak in his private voice, a tone apparently known to everybody and never described. Night also had its inventory of kindly hazards. Fog turned corners into negotiations. Snow politely covered evidence and insisted on making the footfalls squeak. Ice revealed the precise number of nails in a watchman's boots because each one announced itself individually on the cobbles. The rattle behaved consistently no matter the weather. The spring did not believe in seasons. If the evening was clear and cold, a single turn carried for astonishing distances, the notches cutting the air as a skater cuts ice. In wind, the watchman leaned, measured, and leaned some more, learning the exact angle at which a clack returns like a boomerang. A lamplighter once claimed to steer by the sound, as sailors steer by a bell through fog. No one argued. It sounded true in a way that cannot be verified without cooperating fog. There were microeconomies clustered around the watch. Carvers specialized in handsome rattles, offering premium models with carved finials lions if the town had opinions about bravery, barley sheaves if it had opinions about honest work. Guilds presented engraved rattles to retiring beadles who hung them over mantelpieces with the gravitas of sabers. Pawn shops and lean months accepted watchmen's rattles as security on strict terms and returned them with an air of relief. Some rattles bore numbers to match their precinct. Others carried small repairs in brighter wood, the patched places polished by a grateful hand. If a rattle broke on duty, the city clerk recorded it like a person, with cause and time and often a sympathetic adjective. The phrases of the job are marvelously steady. Who goes there? Belongs to the ages and to the stage, but the watch actually preferred who's that? Quicker, kinder, and better at catching the truth unprepared. Move along is listed in several manuals as acceptable in general, which is an administrator's way of recognizing that specificity at 3 a.m. is not always a virtue. The watchman's shout of the hour typically included whatever felt like the mood of the street. Past 4, followed by steady rain, gives a household enough information to roll over convincingly. Past 1, streets clear, is the city equivalent of a lullaby's second verse dot. It is typical of history to employ instruments just long enough for them to become beloved, and then to replace them with something louder and efficient. Police forces arrived, clocks grew precise, whistles shrieked in a pitch the century decided meant seriousness, and the rattle retired to museums and boxes. But before dismissal, there was a curious transitional moment when both whistle and rattle lived together. The whistle was kept for sharp news, the rattle for wide news. You whistled for a fight, you rattled for a fire. You whistled for a thief whose self-esteem found the sound overly theatrical. You rattled for a missing child, because every window needs to hear. The division of labor made sense to everyone and to nobody, which is a sign of good policy. A few regulations survived as affectionate fossils. Some towns kept the hour call long after they ceased to expect burglars to be deterred by grammar. There is a London street where, until embarrassingly late in the 19th century, a watchman shouted 12:30 to a population that included men discussing steam valves. The shout meant almost nothing by then. It was simply what night sounded like. In Switzerland, certain places turned the call into a song and gave the job to people with singing voices. The effect is exactly as soothing as you imagine history's version of a sleep playlist. With more wool dot every now and then, a misunderstanding marched into the minutes with its boots on. In York, a watchman sounded his rattle urgently because he'd seen sparks at the roofline of a baker's shop. The entire lane mustered with buckets, only to discover that the sparks were migratory beetles of a type that glows briefly when annoyed. A natural philosopher extracted one, held it up like evidence, and declared a Latin name nobody remembered. The baker offered rolls by way of apology to the bucket brigade. The watchman wrote in his report, "Beetles bright, not to do with me." Another incident involves a rattle set down on a pub bench for exactly longer than is advisable. It made its way home by 5 different hands and 3 sincere intentions, and the bench acquired a small painted notice thereafter: "No official tools to rest here." The quiet humor of the work is preserved in marginalia. A watchman notes that he stopped a man carrying a chair at 2 in the morning. The man replied that he had not stolen it. He had simply inherited it suddenly. The watchman records, chair restored to original owner, who is not offended as much as he might have been given the hour. Another notes a dispute regarding a cat and leaves the outcome unhelpfully blank, which suggests experience taught him how long cat disputes can last in writing. Technology, polite as always, brought the rattle an afterlife. The mechanism migrated into sports grounds, where a small rattle allowed spectators to sound enormous. It developed an accent at football matches, a rolling roar in miniature. During certain wars, the rattle briefly reappeared as a gas alarm, the clack cutting through engine and shell in a tone that meant, "Wake, move mask." The transformation is oddly consistent. A tool that said, "Be alert," together continued to say precisely that, only faster. After peace, it returned to games and ceremonies and collection boxes, where volunteers crank small friendly rattles and the hopeful beat of charity dot museums keep rattles well. Wood ages with a modest pride. It does not sulk as iron sometimes does. A label will tell you the parish, the date, the maker if he signed his work, and occasionally the route the watchman walked. People pick them up when permitted and perform exactly one turn with the shy intensity of a person trying to pour tea quietly. The sound in a white room is ridiculous and perfect. Children brighten. Adults look for a sign that says, "Again, gently." You can see in the slight arc burned by touch along the handle how many hands have learned the same movement. The object teaches the motion, as good tools do. It is pleasant to imagine the city that still uses them. You in bed, the lane outside doing its night choreography, and far away the watchman's clock rising into the roofs. The window glass relays it to the frame. The frame relays it to the floorboards. The floorboards relay it to the mattress. The sound has less urgency than a siren and more meaning than silence. Someone is there. Someone is walking the streets, so you don't have to imagine them walking themselves. Someone will whine more if needed and less if not. The rattle informs you that statistically you will not need to be a hero before breakfast. A few phrases from manuals deserve to outlive their paper. Use the voice like a lantern is a favorite. Steady, kept, aimed, and when possible, spared. Let the clack be enough is another. A counsel against brandishing on top of sounding, which is the night watch equivalent of all caps. Write the weather first appears in several logbooks and suggests a hierarchy of facts I wish we observed more often. Among the many rules about politeness, there is one entirely practical. Never rattle directly beneath eaves, because small icicles feel larger when falling at speed and intent. Modern analogies are easy and sleepy. The smoke alarm on your ceiling is the descendant of the rattle, only it has surrendered the pleasure of explanation. The phone notification on your knitstand is the descendant too, though it has forgotten how to shout "all's well." If it ever learns, we may finally forgive it. A city's grid of streetlights is a silent rattle, warning without waking. The local social media channel that announces a burst water main performs. The same old civic trick, rouse those who must rouse. Let the rest doze with the useful knowledge that something is already being done. The beauty of such small regimes is that they make the ordinary feel supervised by kindness, rather than by drama. No battle is won by a rattle's courage. No treaty depends on its tone. It simply divides the night into manageable pieces and gives each piece a headline. Pass 2, rain easing, door secured, dog persuaded. You drift between these lines to the soft percussion of wood doing its exact job. The watchman passes and you do not look up. And that is the victory that mattered to the people who bought the tool in the first place. So the rattle remains. A ceremonial relic of a city that chose the sound of modest confidence over the sound of panic. You can almost hear it now, the click beginning somewhere near the market, moving along the lane like light turning pages, repeating at the bridge where water approves by not interfering, pausing by the bakery where heat enjoys company, continuing to the square where echoes patted on the back as old friends do. Then quiet, thoughtfully. Then footsteps. Then the hour called with grammar tidy and hat level. And if you find yourself still awake, you can imagine the handle warming under a gloved palm, the notches waiting their turn, and the spring perfectly content to be ready rather than busy with. Metal, hand, and city all agreeing, very softly, that all is well enough to sleep. You might not expect the single door to outrank the whole apparatus of the law, but there were centuries when a heavy oak door with a saint painted on it could look a sheriff in the eye, and when the hinge ground, a threshold waited, and a small ceremony bigger than any sword unfolded at a speed comfortable for the elderly and the nervous. If you're still awake when I get to the rules about how far a fugitive could wander to use the privy, you're doing wonderfully. Feel free to subscribe or just blink twice in a supportive manner. No pressure. The law is patient here, or at least it pretends to be. The claim began at night more often than not, because the crimes most urgently regretted tend to keep late hours. The church porch was a stern animal with a calm face, a lion carved into a knocker, and a niche of darkness that smelled like beeswax and last Sunday. Someone ran or limped with ambition, or arrived in a borrowed cart with wheels that pleaded for mercy. The door did not ask questions. Doors prefer statements. The sanctuary seeker lifted the knocker and let it fall. Once, twice, a third time in some places, because the Trinity makes a sound the clerk can recognize from bed. A verger's candle lit the corridor, and the sleepy phrase with crisp edges floated out. Sanctuary. For God and for this house. It is the kind of sentence that likes to be said in the exact wording. Like a recipe for bread or for forgiveness. Then the counting started, because even mercy hires a timekeeper. 40 days, or sometimes 40 nights, depending on a region's sense of romance. The number belonged to rain and deserts and Lent. It was a calendar unit with good references. The clerk met you with a ledger that had more rules than pages. Name, offense as you told it, offense as a witness muttered it, town of origin, state of soul, whether you carried a weapon or only a poor reputation wearing boots. He took your belt if it supported anything sharper than a sentiment and led you across the threshold to a space. That made the law do an unusual trick. It stopped and waited outside. Like a dog who knows it is not allowed in the parlor. Sanctuary to not float in the air. It lived within lines as tidy as a churchwoman's hem. Some doors marked the boundary with a brass stud on the floor, some with a ribbon on great days, some with nothing visible, just the collective memory of a town that had been told here and not there for a very long time. The change in jurisdiction could be measured in steps, and those steps were counted by people who liked counting. A bailiff could follow the fugitive to the threshold and no farther. A nephew could whisper arguments from the porch. A priest could shout instructions from the nave, because Echo Assist policy, there was bread. There was almost always bread. It is difficult to craft a grand drama around a crust, which is perhaps why Sanctuary produced so little theater and so much procedure. A loaf and a bowl of pottage found their way to you by hands that had made the same journey a dozen times for different people. A quarrelsome apprentice, a woman who swore she meant to push the door and not the husband, a groom who mistook borrowing for keeping, a gambler whose luck ran out at the precise speed of a church bell. If you had coin, you contributed. If not, you employed your apology as currency. The bedding was straw with ambitions. It smelled like honest work. It rustled in a way straw only does when the night is quiet on purpose. Someone set a horn cup by the step. Water agreed to be patient. News arrived in regulated portions. A brother came to say your mother had sent a biscuit and a sentence, usually the same one: behave. A neighbor hovered like weather, wanting to know where the tools went. Somewhere outside, a sheriff drummed his fingers on a law that had just been asked to weigh upon a door. He took notes about your shoes, your accent, how loudly you chewed. The church, for its part, understood itself as a small country with borders, customs, and a single spoken visa. Inside the lines, everyone used the formal version of the day. Time walked instead of ran. The 40 days had the rhythm of a tide. Morning. The lay clerk swept a path for you and for himself, which is a kind compromise between dignity and dust. He reminded you to keep to the marshes, the invisible edge that made all the difference, and warned you that the root screen was not, under any interpretation, a ladder. Noon brought visitors who had practiced their faces, sternness with affection pasted on like a label. They brought gossip disguised as concern. You asked questions. The answers arrived clean but short, as if the rest of the sentence had gone to an inconvenient market. Afternoon, someone from the guild came to ask if you had any tools that ought to be returned for the greater health of the economy and their shop. Evening, the verger recited the rules again just in case. Clarity had worn thin and a new coat of it was needed. A sanctuary household has peculiar chores. The clerk sharpened the quill that logged your days, recording wind and cloud as though meteorology could explain morality. The sacristan checked the locks on the vestry more often than locks require. The combination of chalices and human nature makes for a nervous padlock. The watch agreed to stroll by more slowly than usual, so their authority could be seen to honor the steps. A neighbor brought soup heat in a pewter pot that had boiled for 3 generations. Cats patrolled like small saints with private jurisdiction. Children slowed, stared, and listened for a story they would later retell incorrectly but fondly. All the while, the law swelled like a tide at the boundary. It did not sleep. It took naps while counting. You could feel it, not as a threat, but as a set of obligations wheeled up like barrels and stacked neatly. There was a list of questions to be answered when a priest had leisure and you had breath. Did you intend the blow? Did the knife intend it? Did anyone else intend it on your behalf? Was it public, which would be regrettable, or private, which would be complicated? The words, benefit of clergy, floated in the air the way a complicated recipe floats in a kitchen, desirable if you know how to make it, indigestible if you do not. As the days slid by, bread became a calendar, and the scratch on the wall became a philosophy. Some petitioners grew penitent in the precise theological sense. Some grew merely tidy, which is another path to improve behavior. A few tried to bargain with heaven using schedules, promising reform beginning next Tuesday. 1 or 2 attempted to leave timidly and re-enter dramatically, just to prove the border still worked. It always did. People respect an invisible line more than they admit. But Sanctuary is a bridge, not an island. The end approached with a polite cough. The clerk studied his tally -30-839, the shape of 40 visible like the nave beyond the pillar. On the last evening, a small conference happened under the tower. A priest, a town officer, and you, with the rattle of straw, performing percussion. They offered the two roads that honesty has always offered. Dressed in fresh Latin, one, swear your oath, accept exile, and walk to the port with a staff and a map you do not need, because everyone knows it by heart. The other, come out and try your luck at law with a jury persuaded by clean shirts and clear voices, which is not nothing, but is not reliable either. Some men took the second path because people are brave. Many took the first because soil is easier to leave than one's bones. The oath had choreography. Bareheaded, hand on gospel, you repeated phrases whose grammar had not been edited since kings wore beards like hypotheses. You admitted what you admitted. You declined to mention what you declined to mention. You promised to cross a certain bridge and not return under pain of being unwelcome in the sort of way that involves ropes. A crown officer produced attuned sternness. The verger, who had seen everything twice, nodded kindly at the parts that mattered most. There was a crowd, of course. Crowds smell decision with a talent no hound enjoys. Someone cried a bit in a way designed to circulate among the neighbors. The walk to the boundary of the county was a civic event with modest catering. A bellman went ahead, which is history's way of saying, make a path, please, and also look. The staff in your hand felt like confession carved into wood. Taverns pretended not to exist for you. They closed their doors in a pantomime you were expected to honor. Children counted your steps like coins. A constable watched the edges of the agreed road and, if you seemed tired, pointed at the exact spot the map loved best. Somewhere near the last bridge, you turned and found the town smaller and your choice larger. Then there was only the road, and the reasonable hope of a ship to somewhere that used different rules. If you chose trial, the procession folded in reverse. The sheriff arrived with a patience that wobbled. The court prepared its drama. Your friends wore their good hats and wished for luck, which is a skill. The jury wanted a story arranged with tidy hinges. You offered them the truth as you recalled it, which employs different hardware. The clerk's notes from the church came along, carrying the scent of candle smoke into the courtroom, and for one soft moment the law and the door considered one another across a room and agreed not to quarrel in public. It went how it went. Sometimes the verdict was manslaughter, a word that tries to put a fence around something that began without one. Sometimes not guilty, which tastes like bread even outside a church. Afterwards, regardless of road taken, life resumed its relaxed insistence. The marks of mercy were small and not shiny. The straw was swept and replaced. The ledger line thickened. The knocker cooled. Someone found a hairpin on the step and put it in the vestry box in case someone asked. In the market, a woman sold you pears without mention of anything, which is a parish's most complicated courtesy. If you had sworn exile, an entire lane would, in time, use your name as shorthand for the taste of the pottage they served that week, or for the winter with the sharp east wind. If you had stood trial, you would become a paragraph in a book nobody reads, except clerks and the kind of historians who keep an ink stain as a pet. The holes in the record are generous and forgiving. Not every face reaches paper. Not every kindness makes an entry. There is a note of unknown woman pleaded weakness, which could mean illness or heartbreak or the practical problem of shoes on frost. There is a margin annotation. Goose created confusion with no follow-up, leaving us to picture an animal indifferent to jurisdiction. One ledger mentions a quarrel regarding apples that escalated to law with surprising speed apples due once thrown. Another lists a man who thought he was asked to leave and so did, which is how bureaucracy sometimes becomes merciful by accident. The mirrors between then and now are soft and friendly. We have rooms in hospitals and offices where the door does something similar. It tells trouble to wait and lets breath catch up with the rest of the body. We have helplines that exist like invisible porches. We step onto them and the noise outside falls into the category called later. We have in our pockets tiny sanctuaries that ask for passwords instead of oaths and keep the world a thumb's length away for a minute or two. None of these are as theatrical as an oak door or as fragrant as straw, but the desire behind them is familial. Make a boundary, teach it a gentle voice, and allow the heartbeat a little room. Time, which enjoys compromise as sport, kept the practice longer than the statute suggested. In some towns, people still knocked because the door had a memory even after the law had tidied its language. A verger would open out of habit and find. A student with a panic, a sailor with a toothache, a widow with papers. He would set them down, find bread, make phone calls eventually, but first he would do what doors do best. He would admit. The church became a social worker that owns a bell. Some were a sheriff, hearing about it, shrugged in a way that belonged to the new century and the old at once. There were tokens and traces. A thin scratch at hip height on the jamb where anxious rings had tapped. A darker patch on the step where kneeling polished stone into obedience. A nail hammered where a sanctuary cross once hung, the shadow of it still the size of a hand. In a drawer, the clerk's iron key to the chest that held the ledger, its bit worn to a shape that knows only one lock. On a high shelf, a brass ladle for soup that the sacristan always returned facing the same way, because his job was order at any scale. In a museum, a notice explaining the practice in a paragraph that leaves out the thick smell of tallow on a cold morning, and the exact way the verger's voice made the words, "for this house," into an address you could live at for 40 nights. If you listen at the right door, even now, very late, you can almost hear the ceremony replay itself. A running step slows to a purposeful walk. A hand finds iron. 3 knocks cross the hours like herons crossing a river awkward, determined, historic. A latch moves. The air inside the porch bears its head. Someone speaks the exact sentence because changing it would be untidy. A clerk begins a page. Outside, the law sighs and sits on the step in a companionable manner because even law prefers good company to the cold. The ledger opens, the bread is broken. The straw takes a breath, and the night, always more patient than we think, shifts its weight a little to make space. None of this ends. Exactly. The door continues to grant smaller mercies, a place to wait out a shower, a soundboard for a whispered confession about losing a glove, a cool surface for a child's forehead. The city has learned to call a truce with itself in small squares and quiet foyers. Meanwhile, the records, which never pretend to be complete, keep their habits of total certainty about tiny things, the date, the moon, the witness's name, and generous vagueness about the parts that mattered in a more difficult way. All while, a clerk writes at the end of one entry, the line is thinner than the others, as though the ink had decided to rest, and so the story does what sanctuary always asks stories to do. It waits at the threshold, not demanding a verdict, only requesting a little attention for the exact machinery of kindness. Somewhere a door creaks, somewhere a law takes notes, somewhere straw sighs with deep expertise. A bell might mark the hour. The wind might mind its manners. The words might come out in the correct order, familiar as a prayer stitched by many hands. You might feel your eyes closing, not in fear of pursuit, but because the rules are clear, the bread is warm, the ledger is dry, and the night has agreed just for now to be a country where borders are drawn softly enough to sleep.